This is a bit late in the video to be bringing this up, but I did actually like grow up on a hobby farm. I had a pet sheep and it wasn't like a proper farm, but again, I had a pet sheep. I'm not saying I'm a voice of authority here, but like, hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today I'm going to be recommending you books to read if you love Stardew Valley. Stardew Valley is one of my favorite games of all time. I have put an ungodly number of hours into Stardew Valley. These books are all going to be books that have like a lot of like natural imagery in them, books with like themes of community, books about farming, stuff like that. And also for those of you who wanted to see it, but I mean, it doesn't really matter if you didn't want to see it, there will be snippets of my Stardew Valley farm in this video. So yes, look forward to that. But anyway, let's jump straight into the video and I'm going to be sharing with you 8 books to read if you like Stardew Valley. Very first book on my list is Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. I read this book recently and it's a really beautiful coming of age. There's a hair in my face. What are you doing? It's a really beautiful coming of age story mixed with a murder mystery, mixed in with all of this really amazing natural imagery of the like swamps and marshes around North Carolina. We have our main character whose name is Kaya Clark. She is the marsh girl. She is othered by everyone in the town. She grows up in this really isolated way out in the marshes. When Kaya is an adult in 1969, the quarterback of the football team turns up dead, and all of a sudden everyone's wondering who committed this murder, and because Kaya is the outsider, they blame Kaya. And jump back in time to Kaya's childhood. This story is just stunning. I really loved it, and I especially loved the depictions of nature in this story. Kaya is a really talented naturalist, and so her character really cares about the environment and all of like the birds and creatures in the marsh. This book is really perfect for people who love Stardew Valley because it's a wonderful meditation on nature. There's not a great community here because, as I said, Kaya is quite othered, but the imagery is so beautiful. And if you really want to read a good character-driven story that has a lot of like amazing like depictions of the marshes, the swamps, the trees, the birds, and how they all interact with each other, this is a wonderful book for that. All of the beautiful natural imagery in this book made me feel so calm and at peace with the world. I just really loved it. I've never really cared about swamps before, but now I do, thanks to this book. I do recommend it if you like the game Stardew Valley. Book number 2 on this list is called Braiding Sweetgrass. This is a non-fiction book and it is written by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a botanist, and she's also a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. This book considers the environment through a lens of Indigenous wisdom and teachings. It considers our relationship to the land and asks a lot of really interesting questions like, do we believe that we as human beings are good for the land? The way that Indigenous people of like North America look at this is very different to the way that Westerners look at this, and so I really loved conversations that were had in this book. I honestly learnt so much from it and I found it just like really intriguing and so insightful. And because Robin Wall Kimmerer is also a scientist, she considers her journey as a Indigenous scientist coming into like going into studying and coming into the world of science with her perspective and how that sort of clashed with these like very like Western approaches to science and to botany and to nature. We also get to hear quite a bit about her culture and her language and stuff like that, so I thought there was a lot of really wonderful things in this book. But because it is an exploration of nature and specifically the environment of like North America, I thought it was a really beautiful read. I found it very calming and comforting, and if you're looking for a book about nature which isn't necessarily a novel, I think this is an excellent one to pick. And so again, the reason why I'm recommending this for people who love Stardew Valley is because there's so much I learned about the environment, about nature, about foraging for vegetables, and like just people's relationship to the land and to the environment. I just thought it was a wonderful book, and if you like plants and nature, I think you'll like it too. The next book on this list is Anne of Green Gables. This is a book I've spoken about quite a bit on this channel, but I will introduce it for anyone who isn't familiar with this super famous book. Anne of Green Gables is about a young orphan whose name is Anne. She is quite a chatterbox child. She is always getting into mischief and scrapes, and she has had a really horrible, sad childhood. She's been in orphanages and foster homes, but she finds a family with Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert, who are siblings, on this idyllic farm called Green Gables, which is located on Prince Alfred Island in Canada. The natural imagery of this book is so stunning. It's almost to the point where it's like enchanting and magical. This is a middle grade story. It is a kid's book, but I was really surprised when I first read this with how much focus there is on like the natural environment and plants and the sort of locations around the farm of Green Gables. Again, this is perfect for people who love Stardew Valley because this is set on a farm, probably like one of the most like famous farms in human storytelling. But like, yes, I love Anne of Green Gables. I think this is a beautiful, comforting read. For those of you who don't really read children's books or like middle grade as much, there is a lot of depth here. I think this is a really wonderful story, and I love this one so much. And again, amazing natural imagery. It's so beautifully written. Definitely recommend if you're looking for natural themes. Book number 4 on this list is The Lost Flowers of Alice Hart by Holly Ringland. Now, I borrowed this book from the library like 2-ish years ago, I think, but I really love it so much. It's a really, really beautiful exploration of nature, as many of the books on this list are, but the difference here is that this book is actually set in Australia. For some reason, I don't tend to love books that are often set in Australia, but I do love this one. The premise of the story is that we have our main character, whose name is Alice Hart. When she's 9 years old, she goes through a terrible family tragedy, and she has to leave her like really beautiful seaside town, which is in Queensland, and go move in with her grandmother, whose name is June. Now, June is a flower farmer, and she teaches Alice the language of flowers. And so this is a story about Alice growing up and Alice healing through trauma and communicating with the symbols of flowers. It's set on this lovely flower farm in the country, and it sort of juxtaposes the like seaside imagery of like Alice's childhood, the farm, which is in the country, and also outback Australia. And so there's a lot of like really beautifully depicted settings in this book, but like most of the book takes place on the flower farm. And so if you're the type of person who likes to have a lot of flowers in Stardew Valley, maybe you also have a lot of bees. That's my favorite thing. I have a section on my farm that has like all of these flowers and all of these little bee huts. This is maybe the book you're going to want to read more, because there's lots of flower farming in this book. Regardless, it's a really beautiful story. I think it's quite a poignant and wonderful story about trauma and healing from trauma. A lot of wonderful natural imagery, and I really, really love it. The 5th book on this list is The Forest of Wool and Steel by Natsu Miyashita. This is a book about a young man who wants to be a piano tuner. It is set in northern Japan, and so there's a lot of like lovely snowy imagery in this particular book. And the reason why I'm recommending it is because it is such a simple, wholesome story. There's no like sad, disturbing like underlying things here. It is just a story about a young man who wants to learn how to tune the piano. He doesn't play the piano, he just wants to learn how to tune them. And it's so wholesome and lovely. And so it's a story about simple, realistic ambition and his like resilience, and you know, he's not very good at it to begin with, and the relationships that he builds with this community of people who like all get their pianos tuned, and it's just so lovely. I feel like in a way a lot of us play Stardew Valley because we know it's going to be very comforting and wholesome. I never feel stressed playing Stardew Valley, like unless I'm specifically in the mines and time is running out and like that music starts and all of the bugs happen, that's stressful. But as long as we're not in the mines, I don't feel like I'm ever going to get stressed out playing Stardew Valley. And I feel like this is the least stressful book I own. It is so calming and gentle. It's a very slow story. Don't come into this expecting like a really like wavy all over the place plot. It's just a really simple, beautiful story. Again, a lot of wonderful natural imagery because the piano is like compared to the forest, and in the book it says that like the piano and what type of wood from the forest will affect the piano and all that kind of stuff. I love this book because it's so simple and slow and comforting and not stressful. Book number 6 on this list is The Traveling Cat Chronicle by Hiro Arikawa. This story is narrated by a cat whose name is Nana. I just love that fact about this book. It's really well done, and it sounds a bit like gimmicky, but it's just so beautifully done. The cat's name is Nana and his owner's name is Satoru, and the cat is going on a road trip. They travel across Japan meeting people from Satoru's life. And this story, I think that if you're the type of person who picked a cat as your pet while you were choosing your pet in Stardew Valley, I think you would like this. But also there's again a lot of amazing natural imagery in this book. The way that this author depicts a number of the scenes in this story is just so incredibly beautiful. Like I loved it so very much. Again, with themes of community, I feel like the relationships that Satoru has with all these people are really strong and really impactful. And Stardew Valley is really wonderful in that, because a lot of people see it as like a farming game first, but there's actually a really amazing element where you go and meet all of these people and then you become friends with them and you forge relationships, and it's like this really wholesome part to that game. And so this story is like looking at the impact of these people on Satoru's life. Nana is perceiving that through the lens of a cat. Fair warning, I bawled my eyes out in this book. I was listening to the audiobook and I just cried and I cried and I cried. I love this book so much. It was so cathartic to read, and it's just a beautiful, emotional book. Great if you're the type of person who picked a cat as your pet in Stardew Valley, but otherwise, just such a lovely book. Oh, and I almost forgot to say, one of the friends that Satoru has is a part of a farming club. So that's the other area in which this is linked to Stardew Valley. There is someone who does farming stuff in this and grows his own vegetables. Book number 7 on this list is The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. I've talked about it so much to the point where like I am aware I need to stop talking about this book, but I tried really hard to take it off this list and I couldn't, because there is an aspect of this book that perfectly aligns with Stardew Valley. So when you kick off and you start playing the game and you're in this like office environment and you're miserable and it's very grey and it's awful, and then you get a letter from your grandpa, but you realize you can actually leave this office environment and go travel away from the city and all of that stuff and go live in the country on the farm that belonged to your grandfather. And so this sort of like transition from like the dull grey 9-to-5 awfulness into like the natural lovely environment. So the same thing happens in The House in the Cerulean Sea. And so at the very beginning of the novel, we have Linus Baker, who works at the department in charge of magical youth, which is an organization that puts magical children into these orphanages, and it's really horrible. They get segregated from society, and Linus's job is to inspect the orphanages. He really hates his job. It is so grey and lifeless and sad and depressing, until the day that he travels to the titular house in the Cerulean Sea and he is suddenly immersed in this bright, colourful natural world. And so these sort of parallels are really, really strong, and so that's why I wanted to put this on the list. And overall, I really love The House in the Cerulean Sea. It's one of my favourite books I've read this year. So if you really liked that first world building aspect of Stardew Valley, you might like this book as well. Okay, and the very last book on this list is Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. This is a book I spoke about heaps and heaps last year. This is a non-fiction book, and it's probably one of my favorite non-fiction books of all time. Essentially, this book is a like brief and really interesting history of the human race. And so it considers like our whole journey from like evolution to being hunter-gatherers to agriculture, why we have religion, why we have the economic systems that we have, and all of this kind of stuff. It is so interesting. If you're interested in history, please go read this book. But the reason why I wanted to recommend it to people who love Stardew Valley is because the sort of portion of this book that speaks about the hunter-gatherer period and the transition into the like agriculture age is so interesting, and I really I found that so fascinating, and I feel like I learned a lot about our species and like why we do the things we do, and it really changed the way I think about the agriculture industry. Like that specific section had a really big impact on me. And I feel like if you're interested in like a farming game and like it's a small farm, right? It's a sustainable small farm. If you're interested in like the sort of like return to like the slower, simpler life, and looking at the difference between having a small farm and having these big massive farms, I think you'll find this portion of Sapiens really, really interesting. This is a bit late in the video to be bringing this up, but I did actually like grow up on a hobby farm. I had a pet sheep, and it wasn't like a proper farm, but again, I had a pet sheep. I'm not saying I'm a voice of authority here, but like I found it interesting. So yes, that's basically what I'm saying. But especially if you're interested in like agriculture and our history around agriculture, I really recommend reading this book. And that was it. That was the last book on this list. Thank you guys so very much for watching. Thank you to everyone over on Patreon for supporting this channel. Take care, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.